What if I told you the happiest moment in Keith Urban's life might actually be the most suspicious one yet? Yeah, let that sink in, because when a man who's been in one of Hollywood's most perfect marriages suddenly looks straight into the camera and says, "I can finally breathe," that doesn't sound like joy. That sounds like survival. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Why now? Why after all these years with Nicole Kidman, the red carpets, the smiles, the power couple image does happiness suddenly feel different? Was it really love? Or was it something else hiding in plain sight? Because insiders are starting to whisper. Fans are starting to rewind old interviews. And the internet? Oh, it's doing what it does best, connecting dots nobody dared to connect before. We're talking alleged control, alleged emotional pressure, and a biggest regret that Nicole herself may have quietly admitted without ever saying it out loud. So buckle up, because this isn't just a breakup story. This is the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about fame, relationships, and what really happens when the cameras turn off. And just like that, the moment he said those words, the narrative around Keith Urban started shifting in a way nobody expected, because according to people allegedly close to the situation, this wasn't just a casual reflection about life after divorce. It wasn't a polite celebrity answer crafted for interviews either. It was described as something heavier, something that felt like a release that had been delayed for years. The kind of statement that doesn't come from happiness alone, but from surviving something that had been quietly building behind closed doors. And the name sitting at the center of all this attention is, of course, Nicole Kidman. Now, before anything spirals out of control, let's be clear about what's being claimed here in the public conversation. Nothing is officially confirmed. There are no verified reports of scandal, no legal filings suggesting wrongdoing, and no direct statements supporting the extreme interpretations floating online. But in the world of celebrity culture, especially when silence meets speculation, the story often writes itself long before facts ever arrive. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because insiders, at least the ones gossip pages keep referencing allegedly, suggest that the dynamic between Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman was never as effortless as it appeared on red carpets. To the public, they were the definition of stability in an industry built on chaos. Smiling photos, coordinated appearances, affectionate interviews. A couple that seemed untouched by the usual Hollywood breakdown cycle, but behind that polished image, the narrative now being pushed by online commentators paints a very different emotional landscape. One where Keith Urban, over time, allegedly began to feel less like an equal partner and more like someone constantly adjusting himself to maintain peace. Not through one dramatic moment, but through years of small compromises that slowly built up into something heavier than either success or fame could balance. And that's where the internet starts doing what it does, best rewinding everything. Old interviews are suddenly being watched with new suspicion. Moments that once felt normal are now being analyzed like hidden messages. A pause here, a smile that looks slightly forced there, a comment that seemed harmless at the time, but now gets framed differently depending on who is dissecting it. And in this rewritten narrative, every detail becomes evidence of something deeper. Some online voices claim Keith Urban's recent remarks about finally feeling like he can breathe are not just about divorce recovery, but about emotional release from long-term internal pressure. They argue that his tone didn't sound like celebration, it sounded like distance. Like someone stepping away from a space where they had been holding their breath for too long without realizing it. But again, this is where reality and storytelling start to blur, because there is also a completely different interpretation being pushed by fans who reject all of this speculation. They argue that what people are calling hidden suffering is actually just projection. That Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman were simply a private couple who chose boundaries over public oversharing. And that silence is being misread as secrecy. Still, the more the internet debates, the more the narrative expands. And in expanded narratives like this, someone always becomes the focal point of emotional responsibility. In this case, the speculation increasingly revolves around Nicole Kidman being positioned fairly or unfairly as the dominant emotional force in the relationship dynamic being described by online commentators. Some posts suggest she carried the public image more strongly. Others suggest she set the tone of control in private settings. But none of these claims come with evidence. They come with interpretation. And interpretation spreads faster than truth ever does. What makes this story even more combustible is the idea of regret. That word has been floating around social discussions attached to this entire situation, often framed as something Nicole Kidman allegedly acknowledged in hindsight. But again, nothing concrete exists to support that. No verified interview, no direct statement, nothing beyond speculation layered on speculation. Yet in viral culture, even a suggestion of regret is enough to reshape perception, because once people believe someone might regret a past relationship dynamic, they start reevaluating everything that came before it. Every public smile becomes suspicious. Every silence becomes intentional. Every separation becomes a hidden story waiting to be decoded. And Keith Urban's calm, grounded post-divorce presence only fuels that cycle further, according to online commentary threads. His behavior is being interpreted as post-liberation stability, a phrase that sounds dramatic but essentially reflects how audiences perceive celebrities after a major life change. If someone appears calmer, the assumption becomes that they were previously restricted. If someone appears happier, the assumption becomes that they were previously unhappy in a hidden way. But none of this confirms anything about reality. It only confirms how people interpret change, and still, the conversation refuses to slow down, because the deeper layer of this story isn't really about celebrities. It's about the idea of image versus experience, about how public figures can live what looks like a perfect life, while audiences slowly build alternative versions of their reality based entirely on fragmented moments. That's why even neutral comments from Keith Urban are being turned into emotional testimony. A simple reflection becomes a confession. A calm statement becomes a revelation. And a private life becomes public courtroom drama without any official case ever existing. Meanwhile, Nicole Kidman remains almost entirely absent from this wave of interpretation. No direct responses. No engagement with rumors. No participation in the narrative being constructed around her name. And in the absence of response, the internet does what it always does: it fills silence with meaning. Some interpret that silence as dignity. Others interpret it as strategy. Others interpret it as something more complicated that fits their preferred version of the story. And that is how modern celebrity narratives evolve, not through facts, but through collective imagination. As this discussion continues to grow, one thing becomes clear: the story is no longer just about what was said. It's about what people think was meant. And in that space between words and interpretation, Keith Urban's simple statement about happiness transforms into something much larger than itself, a symbol of release, a symbol of hidden struggle, a symbol of a life that the public believes it understands, even though it never truly had access to it. And as the speculation intensifies, the internet begins to shift from asking what happened to asking how long it had been happening, without anyone noticing. But what nobody can agree on is whether there was ever anything to notice at all. And that uncertainty is exactly where this story takes its next turn. And as that uncertainty continues to spread across social media, the narrative surrounding Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman begins to shift into something even more intense. Something less about interpretation and more about imagined backstory being treated like uncovered truth, because once a story reaches this stage, it stops being about what was actually said and starts becoming about what people believe must have been happening behind the scenes all along. And according to the online conversation building around this situation, the focus now is not just on Keith Urban's comment about finally feeling happy, but on what that happiness supposedly replaces. The internet is no longer satisfied with surface-level explanations. It wants emotional cause and effect. It wants a before and after narrative that feels complete, even if parts of it have to be filled in with speculation. That's where the second wave of claims begins too. Circulate. Anonymous online sources and gossip commentary. Accounts have started suggesting that the marriage dynamic between Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman allegedly had layers of emotional imbalance that were not visible publicly. In this version of events, Keith Urban is described as someone who gradually became quieter within his own life, not silent in a literal sense, but emotionally reserved in a way that insiders allegedly interpreted as withdrawal rather than stability. These claims often describe a pattern where one partner is seen as increasingly adapting, adjusting, and compromising while the other maintains a stronger sense of control over the relationship's public and private rhythm.
But it is important to emphasize that none of this is backed by verified reporting. It exists entirely within the ecosystem of online commentary, speculation, and fan interpretation. Still, in viral culture, repetition often replaces verification. And as these ideas circulate, fans begin revisiting old clips of the couple with a completely different mindset. Interviews that once felt affectionate are now being paused and rewatched frame by frame. Moments where Keith Urban appears quiet while Nicole Kidman speaks are being reframed as symbolic imbalance. Even casual humor between them is being analyzed as possible emotional signaling. What makes this particularly powerful is not the content itself, but the way audiences project meaning onto it. A smile becomes compliance. A laugh becomes discomfort. A pause becomes emotional distance. None of these interpretations can be confirmed, but they spread because they fit neatly into a narrative that people are already emotionally invested in. And that emotional investment is what drives the story forward. At the same time, another layer of discussion begins forming around Keith Urban's personal transformation after separation. Social media users and commentary channels point to his more recent public appearances, describing him as noticeably lighter, more relaxed, and more expressive. Again, this is subjective perception, not measurable fact, but it becomes the foundation for a powerful narrative shift. Because in the eyes of the audience, visible change must always have a hidden cause. And that cause, in this case, is being framed as long-term emotional pressure that allegedly built up over years. Some commentary claims that Keith Urban may have experienced a situation where his personal identity slowly became secondary to the relationship dynamic. They describe this as a gradual loss of individuality within a highly public life, where expectations, schedules, and image management allegedly shaped day-to-day existence. But even within these narratives, there is no concrete evidence of conflict, control, or emotional harm. There are only interpretations layered over silence and distance. Meanwhile, Nicole Kidman remains completely outside the conversation in terms of direct response. No interviews addressing these interpretations, no statements reacting to online speculation, no engagement with a narrative that continues to expand around her name. And in modern celebrity culture, absence like this is never neutral. It becomes a blank canvas for interpretation. Some people interpret her silence as dignity and professionalism, choosing not to engage with rumors. Others interpret it as intentional distance, a refusal to validate speculation. And others still interpret it as something more strategic, believing that silence allows narratives to settle without confrontation. But all of these interpretations exist without confirmation. And that is what makes the situation so fluid. As the discussion deepens, another theme begins to emerge across commentary platforms: the idea of emotional realization after separation. This concept suggests that clarity often comes only after distance is created. In this framing, Keith Urban's statement about finally feeling happy is not treated as an isolated remark, but as the conclusion of a longer emotional process that allegedly could not fully surface while the relationship was intact. Again, this is not verified. It is narrative construction. But it resonates with audiences because it reflects a familiar human experience. Many people interpret their own life patterns through celebrity stories, even when those stories are incomplete or speculative. That's why this narrative spreads so quickly. It feels emotionally recognizable, even if factually uncertain. And as engagement increases, The story becomes less about the individuals involved and more about the idea of relationships under pressure. Fans begin debating broader questions. What does emotional balance look like in high-profile marriages? How much of a public image is performance? And whether happiness after separation automatically implies hidden suffering before it. These are complex questions without simple answers. Yet the internet treats them as if they are being answered in real time through celebrity behavior. At this stage, even neutral statements are being reframed. Keith Urban's reported sense of calm is being interpreted not just as healing, but as evidence of contrast. The logic being used online is simple. If someone appears significantly calmer after a major life change, then the previous situation must have been the opposite. But this logic ignores other possibilities, including natural emotional progression, personal growth, or simply private experiences that were never public to begin with. Still, the narrative continues to lean toward dramatic explanation. And with that, the idea of biggest regret attached to Nicole Kidman enters the conversation more heavily. Not as a verified statement, but as a recurring claim repeated across commentary channels and gossip threads. It is framed as something allegedly suggested indirectly through interpretation rather than direct admission. And that distinction matters, but often gets lost in viral retellings. Because once regret becomes part of the story, it changes everything. It turns a relationship into a case study of emotional hindsight. It turns separation into a moral lesson. And it turns private history into public debate. Yet despite all of this growing speculation, there remains no official confirmation of any of the emotional claims being made. No verified accounts of toxicity, no documented disputes of the nature being described online, and no substantiated reports supporting the extreme framing circulating in viral content. What exists instead is a layered mix of perception, commentary, and narrative expansion. And as this expansion continues, the story begins to reach a point where audiences are no longer just reacting to events. They are actively constructing them in collective imagination. And that is where the third phase of this narrative begins to form, where speculation starts turning into perceived certainty, and where public interpretation starts to take on a life of its own beyond the original moment that started it all. As the conversation continues to escalate online, the narrative surrounding Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman begins to enter its most intense phase yet, where speculation no longer feels like speculation to the audience consuming it, but instead starts to resemble a fully formed emotional storyline that people believe they understand in detail. At this point, the original comment about Keith Urban finally feeling happy has almost been completely detached from its context. It is no longer just a personal reflection being interpreted differently by fans. It has become the foundation of a much larger narrative about emotional endurance, relationship imbalance, and retrospective realization. And as this narrative expands, online commentary starts treating the situation as if a hidden truth has already been exposed, even though nothing officially confirms any of it. The idea being repeated most aggressively now is that Keith Urban's so-called happiness represents more than recovery. In viral discussions, it is being framed as a symbolic exit from a long-term emotional environment that allegedly shaped his personal identity over time. People describe it as a transformation moment, where someone finally steps out of a life that no longer aligns with who they are. But again, this framing is not based on verified statements. It is built entirely from interpretation layered over silence. And silence, in celebrity culture, is never empty. Because while the internet continues to assign meaning to every expression and every pause, Nicole Kidman remains publicly disengaged from the entire wave of speculation. No direct response, no public clarification addressing the online narrative, and no engagement with the emotional assumptions being made about her private life. This absence of response has become one of the most discussed elements of the story itself. Some observers argue that this silence reflects emotional discipline, a conscious decision not to feed into rumors that have no factual grounding. Others interpret it as strategic distance, allowing the conversation to fade naturally without amplification. And then there are those who interpret silence as something more loaded, believing that non-response indirectly fuels the speculation rather than containing it. But none of these interpretations are verifiable. They exist only within audience perception. Meanwhile, the online narrative continues to evolve in real time. What began as analysis of a single statement has now expanded into a broader commentary about relationship dynamics in high-profile marriages. In this version of the story, Keith Urban is repeatedly framed as someone who experienced gradual emotional compression within a very public environment. Not through any confirmed event, but through a pattern that audiences believe they can recognize when they look backward. Old interviews are once again being circulated, but this time with a different emotional lens. Moments that once appeared normal are now being reframed as subtle indicators of imbalance. Even neutral expressions are being assigned emotional weight by viewers trying to map meaning onto the past. This is where modern viral storytelling becomes particularly powerful, because it allows hindsight to reshape perception. Once a narrative is established, every past moment becomes reinterpretation material. At the same time, Keith Urban's more recent public demeanor continues to be a major focal point. His calmer presence, more grounded interviews, and seemingly relaxed emotional tone are being described by audiences as signs of post-transition clarity. In this interpretation, his current state is viewed as contrast evidence, used to reinforce the idea that his previous environment must have been more emotionally restrictive than it appeared. However, this conclusion is not supported by any factual reporting. It is an emotional inference made by viewers, not a documented reality. Still, it spreads because it is narratively satisfying. And as this satisfaction grows, so does the intensity of the conversation. Another recurring theme in the commentary ecosystem is the idea of unspoken regret, often attributed indirectly to Nicole Kidman through viral reinterpretation of past interviews, public appearances, or entirely unrelated statements that are recontextualized after the fact. This concept has no verified foundation, but it continues to circulate because it adds emotional resolution to an otherwise ambiguous story. Regret, in this context, becomes a storytelling device rather than a factual claim. It helps audiences frame the narrative into something that feels complete, even if completion is artificial. But what makes this entire situation particularly significant is not the accuracy of the claims being made, but the speed at which interpretation replaces uncertainty. Within hours, a single emotional quote can evolve into a multi-layered storyline involving hidden dynamics, alleged emotional imbalance, and retrospective meaning. And once that process begins, it becomes self-sustaining. Because audiences are no longer waiting for clarification. They are actively building meaning from fragments. In the background of all this, there is still no official statement confirming any of the extreme interpretations circulating online. No verified accounts of the alleged dynamics being described, no substantiated reports of emotional control or conflict, and no credible documentation supporting the narrative being constructed across social platforms. What exists instead is a cycle of repetition, amplification, and emotional projection. And that cycle is what transforms a simple celebrity moment into a viral cultural storyline. As the discussion reaches its peak intensity, one final shift occurs. The narrative stops focusing on what happened between two individuals and starts focusing on what audiences believe the story represents. It becomes less about Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman as specific people, and more about them as symbols in a broader conversation about love, pressure, identity, and personal freedom within public life. Keith Urban's statement about happiness is now widely interpreted as a symbolic turning point, regardless of its original intent. Nicole Kidman's silence is interpreted as part of the same narrative structure, regardless of her actual perspective or involvement in the online discourse. And in that space between interpretation and reality, the story becomes something else entirely. It becomes a mirror. A mirror that reflects the audience's own assumptions about relationships, emotional labor, and what it means to leave or stay in situations that shape identity over time. That is why this story continues to spread, even without confirmation. It is not sustained by evidence. It is sustained by relatability, curiosity, and the human tendency to search for meaning in incomplete information. And as the internet continues to debate, analyze, and reinterpret every fragment connected to this narrative, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The story is no longer about proving what is true or false. It is about how easily perception can become reality when enough people agree to believe in it. And with that, the conversation does not truly end here. It continues to evolve, shaped by every new comment, every re-uploaded clip, and every reinterpretation that adds another layer to a story that may never have been fully understood in the first place. So what do you think really happened behind closed doors between Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman?